I want to introduce Bill Skelly, who's the president of Causeway Solutions. We are collaborating together on a project called the Gulf South Index, and it was something we had talked about for a while, and the onset of COVID-19 last year really accelerated what we wanted to do in terms of finding out more about what people in the U.S. Gulf South think about where they live, what they buy, who they trust for information, and how we can bring that information to all of you, to people who work and live in this part of the country. And so this is our first webinar on the Gulf South Index. We distributed our first annual report last week, which is really the culmination of quarterly updates that we've been doing for more than a year. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the insights we have from the report itself and what we've learned about what people in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle think about the lives they live. Are we more optimistic in the Gulf South than the rest of the country? Do we watch television more in the Gulf South? Are we watching more Netflix or less? Are we ready to get on an airplane? What that means to the businesses and the brands of this part of the country as we try to communicate to the audiences that are the most important to us. So Bill Skelly is joining us today. As we get started over the next few minutes, if you have any questions that you want to ask us, we're more than happy to answer them. And you can drop it in the chat feature I believe it's on the side of the screen. So just go ahead and throw a question in there, and we will get to it as we go through the conversation. So Bill, it's good to be talking to a few people about what we've been studying for the last year.
For sure, it's great to see this come to light of day. It's been a fun project to work on with you guys.
And but as we get started too, I want to make sure that we thank Tracy Howerton with the Ehrhardt Group, who's been working on this project with us extensively, as well as Therese Mulvey with Causeway Solutions. They've really put a lot of work into thinking through the types of questions we should be asking and what the data says. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today are things that Tracy and Therese have been a part of with us since we got started. So let's get started. When we started the Gulf South Index, we asked a very simple question, and we asked it late January of 2020, so before COVID-19 and anything had shut down. And we started with a very basic premise. Do the people of the Gulf South believe still in the American dream? And when they look at their own lives, do we look and say that we think we can accomplish and achieve the American dream in a traditional sense in a greater percentage than the rest of the country? And what we found out is the people of the Gulf South are generally more optimistic than the rest of the country, that we have a greater sense of drive when it comes to whether we can achieve the American dream. We have a better image of what the American dream might be. Some people may call it nostalgic, but either way, we tend to be more optimistic about whether this year is going to be better for us than last year and those types of things. So we started with that premise. Where do people sit and think about when it comes to their own lives and where they like to see their lives go? And going into the pandemic, what we saw is that optimism still held for a while. And it held compared to the rest of the country. We were far ahead in terms of saying that we're more optimistic that 2020 was going to be better than 2019. And that's carried through into most of the year last year. But when we talked to people in the late summer, that optimism had started going in the other direction. Even though we, as the Gulf South, are more optimistic, the gap between our level of optimism and the rest of the countries had narrowed. And then when we came to ask that question again in the beginning of this year, what we found is that the national optimism had surpassed the Gulf South's optimism. And we don't think that's necessarily a red flag, right, Bill? I mean, I think for us, I would maintain that we've always stayed optimistic. So the level of despair we may have had during COVID and during the height of the pandemic may not have been high as other places around the country. What did the numbers tell us?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I think it's important to point out that about the same and no's have flipped. So especially in the Gulf South, you now have 30% saying it's going to be about the same as it was last year. And last year they were optimistic about things. They were more optimistic than the rest of the country. So being behind the national average doesn't necessarily show a ton of pessimism. I think it's just a continuation of the optimism that exists. What we do see, and what I find really interesting, as we'll talk about on other slides, is there's a definite gender gap. Right now, men are about 9 points more optimistic than women, and we're starting to get the sweet spot of 35 to 44-year-olds that are beginning to become optimistic. They're getting back to work. They're getting their kids are getting back to school. Summer's coming. People are getting ready to travel, as we'll talk about later. So this optimism really begins to breed other activities, which are going to really get the Gulf South up and running. So I'm super excited about what's to come.
And that's something as we translate and we look at people's personal situations and whether they think that this year will be a better year, or are they more optimistic about it in their own lives, and then we branch it out into the community and how people feel about their community. And from a perspective of people who are having to market to the people of the Gulf South or just communicate with the people of the Gulf South, one thing stands out is that when people are more optimistic, they're more willing to spend. They feel better about their financial situation. They feel better about their family situation. They feel that their kids are getting the type of education and lives that they envision for them. They're more willing to go out. They're more willing to travel and go different places. Now, when we talk about travel, the thing that we've seen very strongly is people are in the Gulf South. They feel good. They're ready to travel, but they're going to travel in their car. And that's something to hold on to as we go through the next few minutes. So when we ask folks about how they feel personally and then try to translate that to their community, so how do you feel about your community overall? What we find is that the Gulf South is optimistic about the future, but I agree with Bill. I agree with you. I think because of the situations we've been in as a region, and you can look state by state, and there's some pretty good consistencies between like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. When people look and they go, yeah, I feel good about where we are. I think a lot of that is attributable to the fact that we've been open in terms of people being able to go places longer than other places in the country. The weather has been better, save for a very active hurricane season in 2020. But our kids have likely been in school in person much more frequently, especially compared to the Northeast and the Midwest and large urban areas. So we've been able to go about our lives and make adjustments, but we're still able to live, which means we were more optimistic about where we are. It also means, right, Bill, it means that we don't see that fluctuation. People don't feel that level of being shut in and now, oh, thank God we're being freed. The truth is we've been free to do a lot of things for a while now, which is good, right?
For sure. Yeah, the national numbers, people are getting more optimistic, and they're coming from pessimism. In the Gulf South, they're like I said before, they're staying the same because they're coming from a place of optimism. You mentioned the state differences. Louisiana, starts to pull ahead a little bit when we talk about your community. They're 10 points more likely to think that their communities are going to have a better year than say the Florida Panhandle, and 8 points more than Alabama. So Louisiana, as I've learned from living down here now for over a decade, has that kind of sense of community a little stronger than the rest of the Gulf South. And so that begins to pan out a little bit in these numbers as well.
And there's a theme that develops in a lot of this, in what we're finding about the idea of a sense of community and the idea of a local and being more local in this part of the country as opposed to nationally, and the way people look at where they're from and what they look for information. And that's something as we go through the next few minutes, it's going to come up over and over again, that being local and knowing local gets more attention from the people who live in the Gulf South as opposed to more national sources of information and where people are getting information from. That's, in my opinion, that's overwhelmingly good in terms of communicating with the people of the Gulf South. But there's some challenges there too, especially when it comes to social media. So as we get to that, let's talk about a little bit about the habits we've picked up, because as a region, we're different today than we were a year and a half ago, right? I mean, especially when it comes to travel and what we're willing to do.
Yeah, in a lot of regards, the pandemic and the shutdowns have advanced some aspects of our society almost a decade. Technological advances, the fact that we're doing webinars today and we're having more Zoom and team meetings than we've ever had in the past. But to your point, there's a lot of consumer habits that we found that are going to really force businesses to change the way they market to consumers and the way they service consumers. 42% of the population said they're going to continue curbside pickup well after the pandemic ends. Another 33% are going to begin opting for carryout rather than dining in. So there's a lot of changes, especially in a city like New Orleans, where we both live, where we're dealing with different types of consumer attributes here. Businesses are going to have to make a change. And Mark, you were on the slide with travel earlier. I just got off of a plane. I'm over in Tampa today, and I can tell you, having been flying for the last 2 or 3 months, it's picking up. People are getting back out there, but it's still a large, still a small portion of the population that are really willing to get on a plane and travel to large U.S. cities. And I think one of the reasons for optimism here in the Gulf South is you see here on the screen, a huge percent of the population is going to travel within driving distance. And I think, I don't know about everyone on the call, but trying to book a rental house on the Florida Panhandle is getting more and more difficult as the summer comes. People are going to hop in their car and they're going to go to vacations. And I think the Gulf South offers that level of driving destinations that is really going to kind of get people out and about. Overall, Florida is kind of leading the charge. 61% say they're going to take a vacation within driving distance, and 68% say they're going to, go to a beach vacation this summer. Louisiana actually leads with willingness to fly, but it's still only 1 in 5 consumers are saying that they're going to take a flight in the next 3 months. We just saw some.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think that wins the 68% of people in Florida going to the beach probably wins the award for the most obvious thing we'll find out today.
That's right.
It is, but it is very much what we've been talking to our clients about, and what we've been talking to different groups about is, as you look at 2021 from a marketing perspective and figure out where should we be marketing, what seems to be consistent, not only in our own research, but other research we're seeing, is people want to get out. There's pent up demand. We feel it in our own lives, like you said. But they'll get in their car before they'll get on an airplane. And the encouraging signs are more people flying, obviously. And you're seeing it in New Orleans, where we are, during the weekends especially. What hasn't caught up yet, and I'm interested to see if that happens this summer, are there going to be middle of the week or weekday type travelers, even for vacations, coming into New Orleans and other destinations in the region. But for sure, if somebody said to me, how should I be looking to prioritize spending my money on marketing my business and my travel destinations, I'd say, man, get out a map and go figure out the places people can drive to you from and focus on that, and then look at the plane travel later. But it's not going to happen that way forever. But for right now, the smart bet is get people who can get in a car.
Yeah, the airplane travel, the large U.S. cities, kind of matches the optimism gap we saw too. Men are about 8 points more likely to get on a plane or to travel to a large U.S. city. And we've actually seen this in other research we've done around the country. And kind of that, as the optimism increases and as that gap shrinks, we're going to see more and more people willing to do those types of vacations.
Why do you think that, in terms of optimism, in terms of willingness to travel, are there any kind of reasons why men may be more farther along in terms of their willingness to do things or their outlook as opposed to women?
No, I don't think so. Or at least off the top of my head, I don't have any really good differentiators. I think one, maybe we're not as smart. Maybe we're a little less cautious and we throw it to the wind a little bit and we get out there. I think I speak from experience, but my wife had to take on all new roles, and all new responsibilities during the pandemic. And I think that she has a much more realistic approach to, getting back to the world really means, and is much more cautious than I am, at least, as well. So some of that could be playing into it.
I see it the same way, even in my own home, like you. Some of what we're doing, especially with this research, is we're trying to find the balance between our own anecdotal experience and what we see and talk to people about and see what it means with the numbers. But that's absolutely true in our house. I'm looking around to my own detriment and to my wife rolling her eyes at me saying, well, come on, let's go here, go there. And she's the one saying, well, wait a minute, make sure we're doing this the right way and following the rules, which I'm glad she's been like that, because that's helped me. But yeah, we'll see. Other folks may have different opinions, but I think that's a good point. So I will say last on the habit standpoint, something I noticed is that we're now like the rest of the country, really, when it comes to our habits in terms of buying. Whereas we may have been pretty good with curbside pickup and things before. We may not have thought about utilizing it just because our habits were one way or another. What we did find when we first started looking into our habits as the pandemic shifted and people were staying home is that we did have a higher percentage of people who were spending more time on things like Netflix, higher percentage on social media, those types of things. And so those are things that maybe we weren't doing in the volume of the rest of the country because just the way we live our lives. But now we've caught up with everybody else. And as you'll look at these different numbers, we're pretty consistent with the rest of the country in what people are doing and what's here to stay. And I would say too, if you have a service business or some type of product or food business, curbside pickup, that's not going anywhere anymore.
Well, curbside pickup and delivery services to that point, Mark. We saw that be quite an uptick in the last couple of months, especially in the index. And I think there are 3 FedEx, UPS, and Amazon deliverers that live on my street these days. I constantly see the truck. So you've got to provide convenience. Have to provide convenience.
That's right. So the other part of what we talked about. So we talked about where people were from an optimistic standpoint, how the habits have changed, but for our purposes and what we look at, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out the types of information that people trust. Because once people trust something and they have certain sources that they trust in getting information and information that they trust, it influences how they take action. And we've spent a great deal of time looking at what people do in looking at local news versus national news. And we've looked at getting information from local sources as opposed to what you follow on social media. And the headline for all of this is knowing local and being local is more important than ever. And what we're seeing in the data is that the world's not getting less complicated, it's getting more complicated. And as more sources of information are pounding people from different directions, people are starting to look at what is nearest to them in terms of geography. They're watching the local news. They trust what the local news is putting out on social media. And whereas people go, oh, well, people don't read the newspaper as much anymore. Yeah, that's true, but they're reading it digitally. And people are reading traditional news stories and it may not be getting them in the most traditional sense for like our parents and things like that, but they're getting news from the same types of places. That's good. If you're a business, and especially, hopefully, it's good if you're a local news source in the Gulf South. It's challenging when it comes to social media because there are splits in there where people do trust the local news sources and traditional sources, and they trust national news. They also trust the groups and things they belong to in social media, which is good and bad because those groups don't necessarily have the same level of standards of accuracy or balance or even truthfulness. There are no consequences necessarily for being wrong or saying things that just aren't true, more or less on social media. But traditional media, there are consequences for that. And so that's something that we're paying attention to as we continue to study all of this. But as you look at local news, people they still look at their network affiliates. They still look at like in New Orleans, WWL and WVUE and WDSU, they're still looking at WLOX on the coast and all the stations in Mobile and Pensacola, and they're looking at websites with local news. And people trust those local news sources. More than 2/3 of people in the Gulf South still trust local news. And it's about the same as what they trust with national news. International, not so much, which isn't very surprising. But then when we ask people about the confidence they have about news and current events, and where's the confidence that you have in the sources that you trust, local news is distinctly higher, both in the Gulf South and nationally, more so than national media outlets like CNN or the New York Times or USA Today or the Huffington Post or any of those websites. Social media, though, there's a little bit of a divide, and this is where Bill's got some insight too, in terms of there are extremes with social media. You either trust it or you don't. And that's something that we have to pay attention to, especially as we're communicating on behalf of brands, is, we have to know the audiences we're trying to reach, and we have to pay attention to what they're saying and how they're utilizing the information we're giving. Go ahead and jump in, Bill. I didn't want to. I'm excited about this part.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I'm glad as the PR guy here. But there's a couple big breaks, right, that occur in that trust for local news. Overall, it's really strong, but Black consumers are more than twice as likely to trust local media than our white consumers are. So there is a pretty big ethnicity divide when we talk about the trust of the local news. I was digging into social media because that always fascinates me, because there is so much information and misinformation out there, and men are slightly more likely to trust social media than women. We get back to that man versus woman debate and where they're getting information and what they're willing to do. We did find a bit of a gender split when it came to trusting social media, but as we're rolling out things like the vaccine and providing information with what's happening in your community, I think it's important for the local media to understand that not everyone is viewing it with the same level of trust. Sure, they're the source that people are going to, but there are definitely pockets of consumers out there that trust it more or less than others. Age was really a parabola too, right? Our youngest consumers and our oldest consumers had the least trust in both national and local news, and it kind of plateaued in that 35 to 44-year-old age group. So that sweet spot of where we're seeing optimism, where people are getting back to lives, and where they're trusting what's happening at the local news, all kind of joins together here at where they're getting information.
Well, and people, I wonder sometimes if that age group of 35 to 44, how much they're thinking about where they're actually getting information from, because they're engaged with their own network, they're engaged with their friends, they're engaged with their coworkers, their families and things, but they're getting information through that lens and through that filter. But it's still, a lot of it's still coming from what we would consider traditional news sources. They just may not look at it that way. Like, we've asked people questions in recent years when we talk to folks who want to either intern with us or work with us. We say, well, where do you get your news from? And, and the most common answer we used to get was Twitter. And you go, okay, well, Twitter's the platform, right? But the people were looking at it like, well, I get it from Twitter. But what they weren't saying is, well, I follow CNN on Twitter. I follow WVUE in New Orleans on Twitter. Some people follow the Associated Press, in addition to following other people who are people that they're just interested in, whether those are influencers or commentators or individual reporters. And so that's where I sort of take some of that, is I think where the information's coming from is getting blurred. The part that I'm concerned about ultimately is, in 20 years ago, one of the things about newspapers is that you were forced to read stories in newspapers that were outside of your personal point of view, because you just had to page through them. Now you can define your interests so specifically through the web and through social media that it's eliminating opportunities to learn, to maybe get a wider point of view as a consumer, and which is limiting more opportunities for people to pick up new things or to consider different points of view. And there was something we talked about last year called news bubbles, where in times of great crisis or times of concern or times of great debate, people tend to have a news bubble that'll harden and it'll shrink around them, where they focus on certain media outlets and certain places to get information, and that's what's locking in their positions. That's something as communicators we have to overcome in all kinds of ways. I mean, whether it's getting people to buy tickets to an event or getting people to understand an issue that's important in their community. And that's something, when we look at social media in the Gulf South, people they like social media more than the rest of the country, and they tend to trust it more.
Well, and Mark, to the point on the local news, though, and some of the age group who we were talking about, this is where I really enjoy getting to test the anecdotal evidence of my life versus the data. And I think what we're seeing, especially in the Gulf South, with children back in schools, and people in that 35 to 44-year-old age bucket most likely to have the school-age children, local news becomes the backdrop to the morning routine. It becomes the backdrop to the evening, dinner preparation and getting the family together and homework. And I think we overlook sometimes how much that information really does kind of like drill into that age group, because it becomes the backdrop to to their day, to their unwinding, to their getting ready
Yep.
for the morning information. So it's really interesting to see that pan out in the data as well.
And really, then what we also looked at too is, in addition to the media, who do people trust in their community, and how confident are people in information they're getting from certain places? And this really stood out to me, because when we take the last year and a half and we look at all the things that took place from a public health standpoint, from a social justice standpoint, from a weather standpoint, and just general living lives, economic standpoint, the prominence of businesses in a community and the prominence of an employer and in communicating with their employees really stood out in terms of what people trust and the confidence they have when they get information from both of those sources. And, not surprisingly, this is right up there with probably some of the least surprising things people will talk about today. And, with 2/3 of people in Florida wanting to go to the beach, less than half of people trust they do not have confidence in elected officials and the information they get from elected officials. To me, that's something that's happened over at least 20 years, and it's been a steady erosion. But from a business standpoint and an employer standpoint, I think that the fact that they are so trusted and people have confidence in the information they're getting is number one for businesses and employers, which are sort of the same things. We need to pay attention to how we're communicating with the people we work with and our customers, because they take what we tell them seriously, and we need to understand that so that we can become better communicators in all types of ways. And then from a social standpoint, it's much more based around who you know and who you follow. Go ahead.
No, I was saying there's one nuance to that point that I want to make, though, is that when we look at the Hispanic respondents and the Hispanic consumers in our region, they were actually in single digits, a great deal of trust from their employer, and it was much more likely to be a fair amount. Almost 41% said they trusted them a fair amount, not necessarily a great deal. And amongst those Hispanic consumers, elected officials were the highest level of trust. So this goes back to knowing your audience and who you're trying to speak to, and hitting them with the right messenger. Our white consumers, our black consumers, across age groups, you're right. It was the businesses in the community, it was the employer. It was that Hispanic subset of respondents we received where elected officials really had the biggest say. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how elected officials can use that platform to speak to that community.
I think you're right. And I'll say this too, as we start talking about how much confidence people have in the information about news and events and how they get through social media. This is something that where the Gulf South stands out a little differently than the rest of the country. And yep. I think, as you were saying earlier, there's an aspect of this where we have a greater sense of community potentially in terms of where we're from, the types of, how we operate within our various towns and places where we live and those types of things. But when you look at what people trust and the confidence they have in the information they get through social media from their friends and from organizations and groups they follow, it's pretty high. It's pretty high, especially when it's compared to news organizations. And I think that's good and bad. I think it shows the trust we have in the people that we surround ourselves with, which is, hopefully good. It doesn't bode well if we have a crazy uncle who decides to spout off all kinds of things about UFOs. But at the same time, what it tells me is when people in the Gulf South like an organization on Facebook or they follow something on Instagram, they place a fair amount of trust in it, and they place a fair amount of trust and they believe whatever that group and organization is putting on their own feeds. And that's good and it's bad. Because if those organizations aren't sharing accurate information, it drives people in the wrong direction. And it leads to greater mistrust, which doesn't help us. It doesn't help businesses. It doesn't help brands. And it creates more confusion and noise. That's my thought.
Yep. I agree completely, Mark. I agree 100%. Yeah, and actually, in that same vein, the younger you get, we talk about age groups. The younger consumers were more likely to be a great deal, and that gap even widens further in the Gulf South. So, as we get younger, that's where the friends even play more of a role. So, kind of this, social media as a platform may not have a tremendous amount of trust, but your social network, your social graph, if you will, the people you're with on a daily basis really do have a big influence over what you're doing and what you believe.
And that's something as we're looking at things in terms of how to best communicate with people, how to create messages and engage with audiences in all kinds of ways and all types of audiences that we can define, is paying attention and trying to listen to what kind of feedback we're getting, and adjusting our messages accordingly, staying accurate, but trying to use language and messages that will cause people to interact and in a positive way, much more than a negative way. It just doesn't serve people well, in my opinion, in the long term. So, but those are the highlights, and so we're happy to answer any questions. I know a couple have shown up in that have gotten to us. But as we jump into the questions, Bill, just give us your final take after looking at all of this and checking some of this out. I mean, if somebody says, what's the one thing I need to remember coming out of this? What do you think that is?
Yeah. So to me, the optimism and the fact that we're coming back, everything is beginning to open up, and we're seeing that in both the data and, quite honestly, seeing it at the airport when we show up to travel. So to me, the biggest takeaway is that businesses, retailers in the area need to be open to that drive time consumer and need to be advertising accordingly, because people are ready to go and will be going this summer. And that to me is encouraging and pretty exciting as well.
I'll tell you, and I agree. I think it feels good. I'm optimistic. I think it feels good to see people more out and about, and it feels like you can sense it. That's like the anecdotal part as opposed to the data part on all of this. I would say the headline and one thing I've taken away from this in this study, and we're going to keep studying these types of questions, is knowing local and being local is more important than ever. Understanding who you want to communicate with is more important than ever. And there are opportunities, but there are also dangers for businesses and organizations as they communicate in the Gulf South. That we're trusted as businesses, but we trust the people that we surround ourselves with. But at the same time, the threat of misinformation or people trying to tell us things that aren't the case to get us to believe certain things, that's more prevalent now. It's more prevalent now than it's ever been. And the more, I believe, we can get people to open up and take in more points of view, it helps everybody, especially as we're communicating.
Well, I think we have to be eyes wide open to the fact that behaviors are changing, right? Consumers are going to want more convenience. They're going to want to be able to order things online, have them delivered to their house, show up, pick up a meal. And we have, again, as business owners and as the business community, we have to evolve to meet these needs in order to stay relevant.
Yeah. So we got one question after a half hour. So I guess we did pretty good. The one question is, are we going to keep studying this? And the answer is yes. We have plans to do a mid-year update. We want to study different questions. What you didn't see in the discussion today is were conversations around vaccines and things like that. What we're trying to figure out is where consumers in the Gulf South are thinking. Where are people what are people in Alabama thinking about, and what does that compare to people in Louisiana and Mississippi? And what does that mean for trying to communicate with and market to those types of audiences? And so we're going to keep going. And so look forward to a mid-year update, and then ultimately the 2022 update we'll put out in the first quarter of next year. But if you have any questions for us, feel free to email us anytime, and either Bill or me or anybody at either place, Causeway Solutions or the Ehrhardt Group, and we're happy to share the information with you. You can also download the full report at tegpr.com, and you can email us that way too. So thanks, everybody, for being with us today, and we're going to talk to you soon. Thanks, Bill.
I appreciate the time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark. This is great.
Bye-bye.
Take care.